Hey everyone, good afternoon. This is Alejandro Delgado. We'll get started in just a minute. We'll let folks get on. I see numbers are increasing.
Hey, good afternoon. This is Sherry LaCour with TDEM. Just want to let you know we are here and we will stand by for the call to start.
Thanks so much, Sherry. Welcome, TDEM. We have still people getting on the call right now, so we'll just give them another minute and then we'll get started. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Happy Wednesday, everyone. My name is Alejandro Delgado, and I am Commissioner Murat's Deputy Chief of Staff. I work in partnership with a lot of folks on this call around supporting schools after disasters, emergency management. You've probably seen emails from me, and we just really appreciate you guys getting on the call and really appreciate TDEM's partnership throughout all this. They've been great and really responsive, and so we're excited to provide you some more information. Before we get started, let me just quick introductions. We have Leo Lopez here, who is our Associate Commissioner, School Finance, also our Chief School Finance Officer for the agency. Thomas Hale, who's the Manager in charge of disaster remediation in the School Finance shop. And then Sherry, do you want to introduce a couple of your folks?
I do. Good afternoon. This is Sherry LaCour. I'm the Division Chief for Recovery for TDEM, for the Texas Division of Emergency Management. And with me, I have Carly Smith. She is over the Disaster Recovery Task Force. She's the Section Chief. And I also have with me Josh Bryant, who is the Section Chief over the Public Assistance and Individual Assistance Program.
Awesome. Thank you. Can you guys see my screen? Is it in full presentation mode now, or can you see the notes? Sherry, you know? Okay, yes. You can see the notes. Okay, I don't want you to see notes. Okay, great. Let me put it, okay, there, that should be good. Thank you so much for those who responded. Okay, so before we get started, the purpose for today's session is we wanted to have an ISD charter school only call. We know that the needs of school systems are unique, and TDEM was gracious enough to provide some time to really reinforce the information that's already been shared. Before we get started, we are going to have some time for questions and answers at the end. What I ask is that you put your Q&A in the chat, one place. And I also ask that the questions that you ask are specific enough so that it applies to other folks in this call. We're not going to be able to answer very specific questions about your district, or if I have X number of pipes like that. That's just, we can't answer those specific questions with the amount of people we have on the line. So I ask that you ask more general questions. We'll get to what we can. Whatever we can't, we'll work with the TDEM team to post an FAQ as soon as possible. So thanks for the understanding there. We'll get started. Most of this presentation will be TDEM presenting, but I wanted to make sure that you guys heard, really reminded about what we at TA have communicated. So two big updates for y'all is one, on Monday, we sent out a disaster aid assistance survey to all superintendents and business officers or business folks in their business office or CFOs on Monday. The purpose of this survey, if you think about how you make districts whole, it's insurance plus FEMA plus the district cost share, and then anything else that's not covered, it's under consideration that the legislature can have a possible appropriation for it under the Texas Education Code. So we need to get an idea from on TEA's end, and the commissioner does, on what the estimate costs are so that we can submit that appropriation request from the legislature. Leo, did I get that all right in terms of explaining the purpose of the disaster aid assistance survey?
Yes, we're essentially just trying to gather information so the ledge has the information as they make their decisions. That's right.
Got it. And we did something similar after Hurricane Harvey, right?
That's correct. Yeah, and the information we gathered informed Senate Bill 500 at the time.
And so given that, what's the timeline you think on from like survey input to possible, if it's ever approved, money going back to the districts?
Well, it's hard to say. It depends on how if they were to pass a supplemental bill or bill, how it's structured. When they passed Senate Bill 500, we had to expend all the funds by August 31. So that's what we did back in 2019. So it depends. If they structured it similarly, then we would have a similar timeline. If they did something different where we had, say, we could spend the money during the course of the next biennium, then that would give us a little more time to work through what I imagine would be a far greater number of applications this time around. So it really just depends on how they structure the funds and what year they're appropriated in.
Got it. Okay, thank you, Leo. And the deadline to submit the survey is April 8th. If your superintendent or CFO did not get the link, email that email address below, FSP disaster remediation @tea.texas.gov, and we'll send you the individual. So if you have no idea what we're talking about, no one ever got a survey, email that email address, and we'll send it to you.
Oh, and Alejandro, if I could just say something real quick. When we sent the link out, we originally we thought we could send it out to both superintendents and CFOs, but something happened in the software where we could only send it out to one contact per LEA. So I would imagine that the vast majority of CFOs listening have not actually gotten a link. And so right now we're working through that to see if we can actually do that. But at this point, I don't have that answer today. So I'd ask CFOs to just hang tight, maybe have the superintendent forward them the email, and we can try to work it that way. As I get more information, we'll maybe send out another email blast with next steps if we're able to send a second set of links.
Got it. Thanks, Leo. And Thomas, did you have an update for folks on the actual filling out of the survey?
Well, it's not so much an update, but it's just
Clarification.
I want to make sure people are cognizant of the fact that question number 6 is a calculation based on the previous question. So read the questions really carefully. That second question talks about your costs. And so that needs to be the larger number. And then we're subtracting with the next 4 questions.
Okay.
And then if I could just add one last thing, the purpose of this data collection is to collect costs that are eligible under Chapter 48 and then under our rule. There are a lot of requirements. Generally speaking, though, you want to think of it in terms of damages to facilities where instruction takes place. So it's slightly narrower than if you would have had damages to other facilities where instruction doesn't take place. So I encourage all LEAs to go and read the statute and our rule in full before we submit the information in the survey.
We also wanted just to note, I'm going through the chat too. Thanks so much, Leo. A couple thoughts, a couple things is we can send up a follow-up, or actually we can put it on our website, the copy of this PowerPoint as well as a recording. So we'll do that in the next couple of days. So there's a few folks who couldn't make it or asking for a PowerPoint, we will include it in our on our disaster website in the next couple of days. All right, and then the next really reminder we have for y'all is, and this was included in our winter weather storm Uri FAQ document, is just remember to document all costs related to the winter storm, because there might be federal funds from the U.S. Department of Education in the form of their disaster relief grants. So like Restart, and I think there's a couple others. And I'll put this in the chat too. USDE has launched a mobile application to support the data collection. So I recommend that you guys go to that link, and for some reason I can't put it in the chat, but just wanted to update you on that. Corey, I think Corey's on the line, who's our Associate Commissioner of Grant Administration. Corey, did I miss anything regarding the USDE grants? No, okay. Well, let's move on. Let me just check the chat to see if anything is there. Okay, we'll answer that. TDEM, why don't y'all go ahead and I'll monitor the chat, and then you guys just tell me when to change the slide.
Perfect. Before we get started, I forgot to introduce our FEMA partners that we asked to be on the call. We have Don Simcoe, the branch chief for FEMA Region 6 for public assistance. He is also on the call here in support of this call. With that, I will turn it over to Josh Bryant. And after Josh briefs, he'll turn it over to Carly, and she'll close us out here. With that, Josh.
Hey, thanks, Sherry. And good afternoon. As mentioned, I'm Joshua Bryant. I'm the Recovery Section Chief for TDEM, and that includes the public assistance and individual assistance programs. So today I want to briefly cover costs that are currently eligible under the winter weather disaster, which is Disaster Declaration DR 4586. I'm going to talk about some next steps for requesting reimbursement of these costs that are currently eligible. And then Section Chief Carly Smith and I are going to touch on how additional damages and costs may be reimbursed at a later date if they're made eligible. But starting with what is currently available under the disaster declaration, I want to touch on FEMA PA Category B, which is for emergency protective measures. Right now, all 254 counties in Texas are eligible for reimbursement of cost under FEMA Category B. And again, that's emergency protective measures under the FEMA PA program. So basically, Cat B means any actions taken during, before, or following a disaster to save lives, protect property, protect public health and safety, or to eliminate the immediate threat of damage to improve public or private property through cost-effective measures. That may be reimbursed by FEMA at 75%. And so that's a 75 cost share for applicants under the current declaration. And that means the federal government will cover 75% of reimbursable cost, and the state or the local jurisdiction or the eligible applicant will cover the 25% share of that. I'm going to dive into more details here in just a couple minutes, providing examples with some eligible Cat B cost that may be eligible under this event, but really it's anything that's tied to an emergency response function to save lives, limbs, or property may be eligible for reimbursement under this current declaration. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so before we go into examples of currently eligible cost, I want to talk about what makes work within a disaster eligible for FEMA reimbursement under the PA program. So currently there are a couple things that applicants need to be aware of. The first thing is that the work must be a direct result of the incident. And so that would be the winter weather event, which I know we all are glad is over. But it would be the winter weather event that began on February 11th and is currently continuing to the tail end of response phases. The second eligibility criteria item is to make sure that work was conducted within the stated incident period. And so again, that is February 11th and currently continuing as response efforts continue. The next item is that work must be within a designated area, a disaster designated area. Currently, that is statewide for category B. There may be some caveats to new categories of work if that's added, but as we stand today, all 254 Texas counties are currently eligible for reimbursement of cost under FEMA category B. And then the final thing is that work must be the legal responsibility of an applicant. So typically under FEMA's PA program, eligible applicants include state agencies and authorities, local governments, Indian tribes or tribal organizations, school districts, which is obviously the purpose of this call, special districts or regional authorities, certain private nonprofits that provide a governmental service in nature, and then houses of worship. I do want you to take special note, and I'm going to hit on this again in a couple slides, that each entity must submit their own application for assistance to FEMA. And so in the case of the school leaders on the phone today, that means each ISD would be responsible for submitting an individual application to FEMA for assistance for category B cost. Next slide, please. All right. So on the screen, I've listed a couple of examples of costs that are currently eligible for reimbursement under category B. These are just examples. There are many more costs that may be eligible, but there's a few I want to touch on specifically just because of the nature of this event. The first is evacuation and sheltering cost. And so if your school or a building within your school district opened to shelter, there may be some cost for reimbursement regarding sheltering within that facility. There's also the cost for emergency access, as well as certain supplies and commodities that may be related to response activities, again, to save lives, limbs, or property. And so as mentioned, category B is really anything that's response related. A lot of times that means local governments have the legal responsibility to perform those actions. But as an eligible applicant, schools may have costs that fall under these categories. There are two really good resources for more information on these types of costs that I want to talk about just briefly. The first is the FEMA Public Assistance and Policy Guide, or the PAPPG, Papa G. This can be found very easily by literally Googling FEMA PAPPG, and it'll be the first thing that pops up on your Google search. This document is the bread and butter of the FEMA PA program. And so any cost that you may have questions about related to the current declaration should be outlined pretty clearly in the FEMA Papa G. The next resource, if you can't find what you're looking for in the Papa G, is something that's called an applicant briefing. These briefings are occurring every Monday through Friday daily at 0900, and these briefings can be registered for on the TDEM website. So what an applicant briefing does is it basically takes this presentation and goes into much more detail regarding the current PA declaration, eligible cost, and then tips for cost tracking as well as procurement. And so I do encourage all ISDs, even if you don't think you have any eligible costs, to please attend an applicant briefing, because not only will it go into more detail about what may be potentially eligible now within your districts, it'll also introduce you to TDEM resources within your localities that may be able to provide more information to you. Next slide, please.
I just want to ask a question really quick that came on the chat. So let me read it out and see if this is the right time. So many of the ISD personnel on this call are also attending the daily briefings and might not have been exposed to PA processes, and they may understand the differences between Pstat, DSOs, TAs. Can you describe how all the different kind of processes work together, if possible, and what's a requirement and what's not?
We will. And so
Okay.
the second part of this presentation will actually go into the DSO, the Pstat, and how that filters into the FEMA PA program. But just at a very high level, and I'm going to let Chief Smith explain this in more detail, but the DSO is the state's first glance at how bad is bad. And so that is information that's coming from our counties and from our cities in Texas to let us know what disaster damages are. The Pstat is a tool that we're using to replace what would traditionally be the joint preliminary damage assessments. And so that would be an assessment of the damages that occur in a joint effort between state, local, and federal personnel. And what that assessment does is it allows us to request either a disaster declaration if one hadn't already been granted, but in this case, it'll allow us to request additional categories of work. And like I said, I'm going to touch on that in a little more detail in a second, and then Carly will dive into it much more deeply than I will. Excuse me. Looking at the current declaration and how you request public assistance, if you think you have costs that are eligible under the FEMA Category B program, as mentioned, there's one thing you need to do, and that's attend an applicant briefing. And the second thing is to submit a request for public assistance or an RPA. This request is only your ticket into the door. It doesn't lock you into anything. But what it does is it makes sure that you meet a regulatory timeline to submit a formal request to FEMA for federal assistance. This can be done by going to Grants Portal, which is the FEMA Grants Management tool that can be found at grantee.fema.gov. On the homepage, you will see a bar that says register your organization and request public assistance. Click that link and then basically follow the steps and prompts from there. Through that process, it'll walk you through submitting an RPA. And as mentioned, that's really just your ticket into the door. And then as you identify cost or potentially have additional categories that become eligible under the current declaration, you're locked in for public assistance, and then you'll move through the process from there. Next slide, please. All right. Before I pass this presentation over to Chief Smith, I do want to briefly discuss what additional categories of work may become eligible under the current disaster declaration. So as mentioned, it's currently only for FEMA Category B, which covers emergency protective measures. But there are other categories of work that may cover other emergency costs or the restoration, cost for the restoration of public infrastructure. But to get there, two things need to happen. One, the state must meet a total disaster threshold of $38.9 million. And the second thing is each county must meet an individual county threshold. So where these numbers come from are essentially costs that are applied to both thresholds are the net totals of public infrastructure damages, debris, and response cost. And so that means that any costs that still remain after insurance or any other federal funding or any other funding source has been applied, basically the net of what's left of those disaster damages feed into the state threshold and the county thresholds. Why that threshold is so important, especially in this disaster, is because it opens up additional categories of work. And if you'll go to the next slide, I'll briefly explain what those categories of work are. All right, thank you. As mentioned, there's really two columns we're looking at here. The first is costs that are associated with emergency work. And as mentioned, category B is already eligible. And then the other emergency work category is category A for debris removal. Because of the nature of this event, we are expecting a little debris removal statewide, but it's not going to be anything to the scale that we've seen like previously in a hurricane. But that being said, there may be some debris costs that become eligible later on. What I really want to focus on is permanent work, and specifically category E, which is for buildings and equipment. Sorry, if you'll go back for me. Thank you, sir. All right, so since today's audience consists of leaders within our school systems, as mentioned, I do want to focus on category E, and I want to specifically dive into what's under the category E. damage cost programs. And so this is not just damage to infrastructure or infrastructure systems like your piping and electrical systems, which obviously had a lot of damage through this event. But it could also include things like contents for files, furniture, IT equipment, anything that basically resides within that building or contributes to that building, like vehicles or things like that. And so what we're looking to do is we're looking to have FEMA add additional categories of work to this declaration, and we really need your help as school leaders, because we understand there's a lot of damage out in your facilities, a lot of damages within your systems, and we need to know what those costs are. And so FEMA funding is not currently available for the repair, replacement of buildings or equipment in the current disaster. In order for these costs to be made eligible, the state of Texas and each county must meet or exceed their thresholds, which we've already talked about. And then we're going to need your help in capturing the delta, capturing the remaining cost that you have within your district that is not being covered by insurance. So with that, we've already talked a little bit about the DSO and the Pstat tool. I'm going to pass it over to Chief Smith, who's going to go into a little more detail and tell us how you can submit those costs to us.
Can I ask a quick question that's in the chat? Do school districts complete a DSO, or do the cities, counties do this for our damage?
Tell me if I misheard this question. I think I heard, do ISDs complete a DSO, or is that just coming through the county? And the answer to that would be that the county, the ISD would submit their costs through the county or the municipality that the schools were residing in, and the city or county government would submit a DSO to us.
Yes, that's accurate.
So just to, thanks, Chief. To just expand upon that, again, my name is Carly Smith, and I'm going to kind of go over the DSO process and then some of the tools. So if you can advance to the next slide, please, sir. This is a demonstration of a traditional disaster flow in the collection of damage assessments. And so obviously the disaster occurs, and traditionally we're asking for the submission of those DSO dollars calculated at a local level. So the ISD would submit to either the city or the county, wherever the property resides. And what we're looking for is that immediate snapshot of, like Chief Bryant said, how big is big and how bad is bad. It's a rough estimate of the level of damage within a local jurisdiction to give us at the state level and our federal partners an idea of the resources and the magnitude of the event, so that we can plan accordingly based on staff and resources that we have available. So the initial assessment would be in the calculation of those rough estimates, and then providing that information over to whether it's the city or the county where your school district resides. Then from there, we would launch these data collection tools. We mentioned earlier ISTAT, which is the individual assessment. It is for your personal property. So you as a citizen within your local jurisdiction, if you sustain damage on your residence, we would ask that you as a citizen submit that. And then you as officials within the school district would submit via the PSTAT, the public assistance data collection tool. Those are going to more validate the information that is put into the DSO. Like I mentioned earlier, that's a rough estimate, and we're starting to try to refine and justify those costs that we initially said we sustained in the actual event. So the individual assessment is completed as the citizens are available to complete online or through a call center that's enacted at a state level or a local level. And then the school district would select a damage assessment team, or if it is not a widespread event, if the emergency management coordinator or campus officials can complete that PSTAT, then that is the desired outcome. They're calculating costs that occur on each campus within each structure and submitting that through the tool. TDEM then verifies that information through the documentation, the pictures, the narrative, and a rough estimate or a more detailed estimate of the cost if it's available. And then that information is shared with our federal partners, who then certify that. And that is the methodology in which to try to secure additional funding for the recovery from this disaster. If you can go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to dive more into the actual Pstat tool, since that's what we're asking the local districts to participate and complete to refine the damage. As Chief Bryant mentioned earlier, we do have Category B already awarded. That's not typical in the disaster process. So I know that that's what's throwing a lot of local jurisdictions off in the collection of the information. We obviously need the Category B information collected, and this tool has a methodology to collect that as well. But we also want to collect the other categories of work to try to justify further potential funding into Texas and into your ISDs. So the PSAT, this is just an overview with the QR code that you can access in a screenshot of what the initial site looks like, but at the end, there's the link and the QR code again. So if you wouldn't mind advancing. And this is a video, if you wouldn't. Go ahead. So this is just a quick video of how to actually use the tool. So when you first log into the link or utilize the QR code, you'll be prompted to either operate it on a browser, or you can download the application on your smartphone, Android or iPhone. You can utilize this tool both with internet connectivity or without. It'll store it either way, which we find beneficial for some of the rural districts and rural areas that we respond to. Tool's pretty intuitive, selecting that you're a local government entity or a local taxing entity or an ISD. You have the opportunity to then drop a marker, a pin at your location, and it'll automatically plot. Or if you are filling this out from an office environment, you can manually input the address of the property that you're wanting to capture within the tool. We specify what type of event it is, whether it is a flood, wind, hurricane, tornado. This is obviously winter weather related, and that drives the follow-up questions. So make sure that you're utilizing this tool in the order of which you see the questions, because further clarification questions will drop down based on the answers that you select. We obviously want to know what school district you're from, who you're reporting from. You don't need to fill in the FIPS number as an ISD, but you are listed as a government entity. These kind of go into the different categories of work that Chief Bryant was discussing earlier. As he also mentioned, we want to focus our efforts with the ISDs on building damage and capturing that building or equipment damage. So it's important that you select whether it is building infrastructure or equipment within the tool, and then it drives those further questions. Listing the name of the campus. Obviously, there are going to be multiple campuses within each of your districts. So designating which campus that is, and then what building that is on the campus. Unfortunately, what I am saying is that this tool is used site specific. So it is not one submission for the entire district or even one submission for the entire campus. We're really wanting to capture the individual damage within each campus. So if there is damage in the cafeteria and damage in the gymnasium, you would want to do two separate entries for that with two separate estimates. The intuitive part of this tool is that it has the ability to list any emergency work that was done and then any permanent work that needs to be done. And then your methodology for collecting that estimate. Was it a rough estimate? Was it a best guess? Did you actually have an insurance adjuster come out and provide you with the information on how you derived at that estimate? And then it asks for insurance information. Do you have a policy? Is this building covered? Is this disaster covered? And then what is your deductible? The application then will compile that information underneath the district and underneath the city and or county where the property resides to help try to meet those parameters that Chief Bryant spoke of earlier, the county threshold, and help justify some additional categories of work and additional help that could be granted to local governments and ISDs as well. You can move forward to the next slide, please, sir. So this is an example of how we view the information as it's submitted. So we have a dashboard on our WebEOC application, and that's a statewide database that allows us better visibility on the needs and the response to local communities. And so I just wanted to provide an overview of what that looks like to us as projects are submitted and how the dollar amounts are tallied, and then that information is provided to FEMA. FEMA does have access to this system as well, so they can pull from it in real time. Next slide.
I have a quick question for you. It came from the chat. Carly, can you show us where to get that tool again that we need to submit for each campus? Pstat, right?
Yes, it's the Pstat tool. There will be a QR code at the end, and then it's also on our TDEM website under the winter weather event. So there will be a link at the end, a QR code, and then it's accessible through the TDEM website. So this is just to reiterate the different categories of work that Chief Bryan spoke of earlier, and a delineation between emergency work and permanent work. Next slide. Not necessary for the application of this tool, but obviously wanted to mention it because there's going to be a need for additional documentation should additional categories of work be allowed. And so this documentation should be gathered after the rapid damage assessment process, which is the utilization of the ISTAT and TSTAT data collection tools. And so I just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware that uploading photographs is important, making sure that you have access to the scope of work, requested estimates or costs or actual costs, your personnel costs, and any additional documentation that's listed here for when that process starts with a recovery coordinator walking you through. So I just want to make sure that that was noted. Next slide. This is a QR code that will send you to some of the links that Chief Bryant referenced earlier. So the field guide for PA and the Papa G that he referenced earlier that really provides you with a lot more detailed information on the PA program specifically. Next. So throughout TDEM, we do have regional staff that are experts in the area that we've discussed today, the PA program through FEMA. They're unit chiefs and they're assigned to the different regions, and this is their contact information. They can serve as your points of contact for additional follow-up questions. And this is a listing of our district coordinators that we have throughout the state. Each district has an assigned district coordinator that focuses more of their efforts on the response capabilities, but can also get you in touch with the other services that TDEM is able to provide. So it's another avenue for resources if you need it.
And that's the last slide, right? You want me to go through some of the chat questions?
I believe that's last, or maybe the one with the Pstat QR code accidentally got left off, but I will absolutely send you that slide independently, and then an additional links page. But everything that we did discuss is on the TDEM website under the winter weather event as well.
That's great. Thank you so much. So just a few questions we've gotten, and I encourage folks to ask their general questions right now. We have TDEM and FEMA on the line. So Carly, question for you. On the RPA, the only disaster listed is COVID. Do we wait until this disaster list is completed?
Hey, this is Josh. I'll make sure I understood the question correctly by repeating it. I believe I heard if an RPA has been submitted for COVID, does the applicant need to submit another one for the winter weather event? The answer to that is yes. RPAs are submitted by disaster. You do not have to wait a specific timeline to submit one. However, there is an RPA deadline. Right now, the RPA deadline is March 21st, 2021 for the current disaster. It is possible that may be extended in the future. However, I would not use that as a planning factor because that's a request that goes up through FEMA. And so if possible, make sure you're submitting your RPA by March 21st, 2021 for the winter weather event. And it does need to be separate from the RPA that was submitted for COVID.
She actually clarified that the only option on the RPA for a disaster, like in the pull down, is COVID. There's not an option in the pull down for the weather event.
So
Hey, this is Sherry. Dawn, are you on the call? with FEMA?
Yes, ma'am.
Hey, Don. Is this, the disaster has been in Grant's portal. So I assume they should be able to see it, right?
Yes, yes. There could be two things without getting into Grant's portal. That's a little tricky for me on this side. It could be that when you're logging in, if you're too far above the organizational profile and you're down into that event profile for COVID, that's the only thing that would show up. If it's showing up at the organizational level and there's an issue, I would recommend calling the Grants Portal help desk and see if they can help you navigate. And I'll verify on our side that it is active and that those RPAs are available.
Thank you. Another question, does insurance coverage need to be exhausted before asking for FEMA money? If so, will FEMA cover the cost of our deductible?
Hey, this is Josh again. Yes, so FEMA cannot duplicate benefits. And so any insurance policies that are in place should be fully utilized and exhausted. However, FEMA can cover the cost of a deductible if it exceeds the minimum project threshold. And so right now for FY 2021, that threshold is $3,320. Any costs that exceed that threshold may be eligible for reimbursement. And so make sure that is getting submitted through the Pstat program, and we will ensure that those costs are captured and sent to FEMA.
Thank you. I think this is a similar question. If your damages do not meet or exceed the insurance deductible, do we still submit those damages through FEMA?
Yes. So if damages are below any kind of insurance thresholds, we also want to see those damages submitted through the Pstat. And as mentioned, for FEMA certification process or purposes, there is a minimum project threshold of $3,320 that'll be looked at, but we do ask that any costs are still submitted through that Pstat. That way we have a good picture of disaster damages throughout the state.
Got it. Thank you. And to confirm, you need to submit a separate entry for incident on a campus. So if the building is affected in 6 areas, would there be 6 separate entries in Pstat?
For the Pstat, it is the survey is filled out per site, and so per building. If it's related to the FEMA Public Assistance Program, is one RPA is submitted per applicant.
Got it. Okay, let's keep moving on. There's a few other relevant questions. Are private faith-based school systems also eligible for this type of assistance?
Yes, private nonprofit schools are eligible for potentially eligible. Let me use words like potentially eligible for C through G categories. Cat B typically not, unless it's like remediation and things like that. And Josh, you want to elaborate?
Yeah, Sherry, just to add that to that a little bit, anything that would be considered a non-critical P&P, so private nonprofit, would need to move through a validation process through the Small Business Administration prior to becoming eligible for any reimbursement under FEMA funding. And so the difference is that those specific types of organizations would need to move through SBA if permanent work becomes available under this disaster declaration. And then depending on what may or may not be covered under SBA would trigger the organization to move forward with any kind of FEMA reimbursements.
Got it. Well, those are the last questions we have. FEMA, TDEM, any other things that you want to say on the call before we hop off?
So I'd like to, this is Carly, I'd like to reiterate the applicant briefing that occurs at 9 a.m. and that link is available on the TDEM website under the winter weather event. It'll give you more of a detailed information on the PA program. And at 2:30 every day, there is detailed training on the Pstat tool and utilization of that application, how best to document your damage. And there's a question and answer period in that training as well. So at 9 a.m. and then at 2:30 for the Pstat tool. Both of those links are under the winter weather tab on the TDEM website.
And what's the deadline for the PStat submission?
So there's not a hard deadline currently. I mean, obviously we would like the more information, the earlier the better, because we are actively trying to appeal for additional funding sources and compensation from FEMA. So as quickly as the information can be put into the system, the better.
Okay. Are there any other deadlines people need to be made aware of right now?
Yes, so there is one additional deadline. Under 44 CFR, there is also a regulatory deadline to request additional categories of work added to the declaration. And so that is also March 21st, 2021. And so any damages that we get through the PStat should be submitted at least a couple days, if not a week ahead of that deadline. That way we can make sure that TDEM and our FEMA partners have a chance to look at those damages prior to the current expiration date tied to the state's ability to request additional categories of work added to the declaration.
And that includes the ISTAT stuff, the individual submissions, right?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
That includes the ISTAT submissions?
That does, yeah. And so both additional counties and additional categories of work both have a March 21st, 2021 deadline to be added to the declaration.
Okay, great. Well, I think that is it. We will be posting this. We'll be posting this webinar, both the PowerPoint and the recording on our TA disaster website in the next day or so. So be on the lookout for that. I think that's it. If there's not anything else, we will end and give folks some time back. Nothing else? Okay. Well, everyone have a good day. FEMA TDEM Sherry, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it, and we will talk soon.
Thank you.